In 1981, a man walked into a hospital in eastern Oklahoma with a burn on his chest. Except it wasn't burning from the outside. It was burning from the inside out. And how it got there, how a piece of metal small enough to fit in your pocket found its way to this man's chest, has never been explained. Tonight, I've got 4 stories for you, and they all share one uncomfortable thing in common. In every single one, the answer was close enough to touch. A small town where nobody comes or goes unseen. A party full of witnesses. A quiet street where everyone knows everyone. The truth was right there, carried in somebody's chest, sitting in somebody's kitchen, standing in somebody's yard. And nobody ever found out. Now, the last story, I want to be straight with you about that one. It happened back in the 1990s, and it was shared years later by the woman it happened to. No one died. No one went to prison, but the man in that story knew her house better than she did. And that one, I still think about every time I let my own dog out at night. So get comfortable. Let's start in Oklahoma. The man who burned from the inside. In January of 1981, a man in his late 30s walked into a hospital in Okmulgee, Oklahoma, oil country, a short drive from the little town of Henrietta, where he lived, and he told the intake nurse he had a burn on his chest that wouldn't heal. Now, doctors in oil country see burns all the time. Steam burns, flash burns, chemical burns off a drilling pad. They know what a burn looks like at every stage, the blister, the scab, the new pink skin coming in underneath. It's one of the most predictable injuries in medicine. A burn gets better. This one was getting worse. The wound sat on the left side of his chest, roughly the size of a man's palm. There were burns down his left arm as well, and it wasn't behaving like damaged skin at all. It wasn't closing at the edges. It wasn't drying out. It was deepening, as if something was still in there, still cooking, weeks after whatever had happened to him. The man said it had started as a red patch. Then the red patch had opened. Then it had kept going. The doctors stood around that wound and understood they were looking at something none of them had ever seen. Because most burns come from the outside in. Heat touches skin. Skin takes the damage and the body repairs it. So the question those doctors were left holding, the question this whole story hangs on, is a simple one. What burns a man from the inside out? The man's name was Douglas Crofut. And to understand why his case would eventually reach the federal government, you need to understand what Douglas did for a living. Because Douglas Crofut was not a random oil field hand. For years, he had worked as an industrial radiographer. Now, if you've never heard that job title, here's what it means. Out in the oil fields, everything runs through welded steel pipe, and a bad weld, a hairline flaw you can't see from the outside, can rupture under pressure and kill people. So the industry hires men to x-ray the welds. And the way you x-ray a pipeline in the middle of nowhere, with no hospital machine for 100 miles, is you carry the x-ray source with you, a pellet of radioactive metal, very often an isotope called iridium-192, sealed inside a heavy, shielded container about the size of a lunchbox. The radiographer cranks the pellet out of its shielding on a cable, lets it expose the film through the steel, and cranks it back in. Simple, routine, and absolutely unforgiving. Because that little pellet out of its container is putting out enough radiation to injure anyone standing near it, and it is completely silent. No heat you can feel. No smell, no taste, nothing. That was Douglas Crofut's trade. Checking welds with a sealed radioactive source, over and over, in every kind of weather. It was decent money in a part of the country built on oil. This was Oklahoma in 1981. Pump jacks nodding along the highway, pickup trucks with toolboxes bolted in the bed, roadside motels renting rooms by the week to pipeline crews. AM radio playing in every cab because that's what came in clear out there. Men like Douglas moved from job to job across that landscape, and their equipment moved with them. Radiographers are trained from day one in exactly one core skill, knowing where the source is. They carry survey meters. They wear film badges that record their exposure. They are drilled on the math of time, distance, and shielding the way a pilot is drilled on airspeed. Of all the people in the state of Oklahoma, a man like Douglas Crofut was just about the last person who should ever be surprised by radiation. He knew the danger better than the doctors treating him did. So hold on to that. Because when the doctors began to suspect what they were looking at, and they asked Douglas the obvious question, "How were you exposed?" this man, this trained expert, gave them an answer that nobody in the room expected. He said he had no idea. And one more thing, the thing that turns this from a medical case into a mystery. If a radioactive source had burned him, then that source was a physical object, a piece of metal you could hold in your hand. It had been somewhere near Douglas Crofut's body, close to his chest, for a long time, which meant it still existed. It was still out there, somewhere in Oklahoma, doing to the air around it exactly what it had done to him. So where was it? Over the months that followed, Douglas's condition did the one thing burns are never supposed to do. It progressed. The wound on his chest grew deeper and wider, and Douglas was transferred to St. Francis Hospital in Tulsa, where the doctors, running out of local explanations, started running blood work. And the blood work is what changed everything. Douglas's white blood cell counts were falling. Now, skin damage doesn't do that. There is really only one kind of injury that eats a man's blood from within while it eats a hole in his chest, and every physician on that case knew what it was. Radiation doesn't just burn the surface it touches. It reaches into the bone marrow, the factory where blood is made, and it quietly shuts the factory down. The case went up the ladder. State radiation officials got involved, and then the federal government, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, the agency that tracks every licensed radioactive source in the country. Specialists examined the wound, the blood counts, the pattern of tissue damage, and they worked the problem backward, the way an accident investigator reconstructs a crash. From the depth of the injury, they could estimate the dose, and the number they arrived at was staggering. The localized dose to Douglas Crofut's chest was estimated at around 400 rads, a burn that reached some 2 inches deep into his body, the kind of exposure you'd expect from being close to an unshielded industrial source, not for a moment, not for a careless minute, but for a long, sustained stretch. Before this case was over, it would be described as the first death from acute radiation exposure from an industrial source in the United States since the 1940s, since the era of the Manhattan Project itself. And through all of it, the examinations, the interviews, the investigators coming back again and again with the same question phrased a dozen different ways, Douglas Crofut never changed his story. He did not know how it happened. He hadn't worked around a source in a while. He hadn't noticed anything unusual. He couldn't point to a day, a job, a place. The most radiation-literate patient those investigators had ever sat across from claimed to be the one man in Oklahoma who couldn't explain his own exposure. Some of the investigators believed him. Many of them did not. In fact, NRC officials would say publicly to the press that they suspected Douglas had exposed himself on purpose. He'd had a previous exposure incident while drinking. He had a long record of arrests. He had money troubles. Douglas denied it flatly, calmly, every single time right up to the end. Because now the case split into 2 problems, and the second one was stranger than the first. Problem 1 was Douglas, how to treat a wound that would not stop. in a body whose blood was failing. But problem two was the source itself, because there was a source in this story, a real, documented one. On December 30th, 1980, squarely inside the window when the doctors calculated Douglas must have been exposed, a radiographic device loaded with iridium-192 was stolen from a locked truck, a truck parked near Douglas Crofut's home in Henrietta. So they went looking, and this is the part of the story I keep coming back to. The NRC and the state didn't search the way you or I would search, opening drawers and hoping. They searched with instruments that cannot be fooled. A gamma source like iridium-192 announces itself. You don't need to see it. You don't need to touch it. You walk within range with a survey meter and the needle climbs and the speaker starts to click, faster and faster, like a hard rain picking up on a tin roof. A hot source in a building lights up a detector from across the room. There is no hiding it. There is no "we must have missed it." If it's there, the instrument says so. They swept the places Douglas had worked. They swept vehicles. They went through the places he had lived and understand what that means. Men moving with a needle across every room, every closet, every corner of the property, listening for the click. And then the stolen device turned up. Not in Douglas's truck, not in Douglas's home. It appeared of all places on the back porch of another radiographer who lived in that same neighborhood. Returned. Just sitting there one day like a borrowed tool somebody had quietly brought back. Nobody was ever charged with taking it, and nobody could ever prove to the standard the law requires whose chest that source had spent its missing days against. The one object that could have closed the case came back on its own and told them nothing. And that's when the investigators had to sit with the shape of it, because there are really only 3 ways this happens, and none of them close. Option 1. Douglas was exposed by accident and truly never knew, except he was a trained radiographer, the one man built by his profession to notice, and a dose like that is not a passing brush. It's a long, sustained closeness, the kind that comes from something carried against the body. Option 2. Someone else put the source near him in his truck, in his room, in something he wore, which is not an accident. That's a person with a reason, who then quietly returned the device to a neighbor's porch and vanished back into ordinary life. Option 3. Douglas knew exactly what had happened, knew where that piece of metal had been and where it went, and for reasons he never gave anyone, he chose to carry that answer instead of sharing it. Accident, malice, or silence. Pick any one of the 3 and part of the evidence pushes back at you. Douglas Crofut fought that wound for about 6 months. The doctors did what could be done, but you cannot suture tissue that a radiation dose has already condemned, and you cannot talk bone marrow back to work. On July 27, 1981, in Oklahoma, Douglas Crofut died. He was 38 years old. The official story of his body was written plainly enough. The first American death from acute radiation exposure from an industrial source since the 1940s. The story of how it happened was never written at all, and after he was gone, the investigation lost the only witness it ever had. The interview stopped because there was no one left to interview. The case file stayed open in the technical sense that files do, and closed in every way that matters. The oil economy of that part of Oklahoma rolled on. The pump jacks kept nodding. The crews kept renting their motel rooms. The radiographers kept cranking their sources in and out of the shielding, same as always. Most of them, you'd have to think, a little more carefully than before. Here is where the 2 questions of this story end up, and I want to be honest with you, because I told you at the start that tonight's stories don't resolve. They don't. The first question was how a man who knew radiation better than almost anyone in the state could be exposed to it massively at length without knowing. To this day, no one can answer that. Either the expert missed the one thing he was trained never to miss, or he never missed it at all, and everything he told those investigators, calmly, consistently, right up to the end, was something other than the truth. Both possibilities are hard to live with. One of them is true. The second question was simpler and worse. What happened with that source? A device loaded with iridium-192, stolen from a locked truck near Douglas's home, gone for a stretch of days that lines up almost perfectly with his exposure, and then set back down on a neighbor's porch like nothing had ever happened. Somebody's hands took it. Somebody's hands returned it. Twice, in a small Oklahoma town in broad daylight or in the dark, and nobody ever saw a thing, and nobody was ever charged, and nobody could ever prove that this was even the source that burned him. Now there's one small mercy in the physics, and I'll leave you with it. Iridium-192 has a half-life of about 74 days. Every couple of months, its fire fades by half and half again, until there's almost nothing left. So whatever burned Douglas Crofut went cold decades ago. It's just a piece of dead metal now. The question of how it found his chest never did. Part 2. This next one takes place about as far from an Oklahoma oil field as you can get, a town in southeast Alaska you can only reach by boat or plane, which is exactly what makes it impossible. Picture a town that is, for all practical purposes, an island. It sits on a strip of land between the mountains and the water in the southeast corner of Alaska, and there are exactly 3 ways in or out. You can take the state ferry, which comes on a schedule everybody knows, and which unloads its cars and passengers at a dock where half the town can see who steps off. You can fly on a small plane out of a small airstrip, where the person behind the counter knows your name and your mother's name. Or you can drive the one road out of town, a road that runs north, up into the mountains, and crosses into Canada through a border station where a man in a booth writes down who you are. That's it. There is no fourth way. Nobody drifts through a town like that. Nobody passes by on their way to somewhere else, because the road doesn't go anywhere else. Every face that arrives is noticed, and every face that leaves is noticed. And in 1982, this town held about 1,000 people, and every one of them could name every other one. So carry this question with you for the next 20 minutes, the same way that town has carried it for more than 40 years. In a place like that, a place with 3 exits, all of them watched, how does somebody kill a 14-year-old girl a short walk from the place her family called home, and then simply never be anyone? Not a stranger because there were no strangers. Not a drifter because drifters can't get there. Just no one, ever. The town is called Haines, Alaska, and in June of 1982, it was, by any honest measure, a good place to be a kid. Haines in those days ran on fish. The harbor was the center of everything, a working harbor, not a postcard one, crowded with fishing boats with peeling paint and names like somebody's wife or somebody's luck. If you stood on those docks on a summer evening, you got the whole town in one breath. Diesel exhaust off the boat engines, salt off the water, and under all of it the heavy, sweet-sour smell of salmon. It was on the decks, in the totes, in the cannery air, worked so deep into the dock planks that no rain ever rinsed it out. Summer was the season everything depended on. The boats went out, the fish came in, and the money made in those few bright months had to carry families through the long dark of winter. The daylight in June barely quit. This far north, the sun hangs on until deep into the evening, and even then it doesn't get properly dark so much as dim. Kids stayed out late because there was no darkness to send them home. There was a movie theater in town, one of those small-town single-screen operations, and that plus the harbor plus each other's kitchens was more or less the whole social map. Doors went unlocked, not out of carelessness, out of arithmetic. 1,000 people, 3 watched exits, everybody known by their first name and their family and their boat. What exactly would a lock be for? Eileen Wafer was 14 years old that summer, and she was the kind of 14-year-old that a town like Haines produces on purpose. Responsible, steady, the one who gets handed the real job, which in her case, on the evening this story turns on, was watching her two little brothers while the adults were out, not babysitting for pocket money at some other family's house. The place her own family called home, her own younger brothers, the safest assignment a girl could draw, in the safest kind of town, in the season when it never even gets dark. And I'll plant the two questions of this story right here, because everything that follows hangs on them. The first, in a town where every face was a known face, where the man who did this was, almost by definition, somebody Eileen could have greeted by name, who was he? And the second question, the one that I think is worse, when it was over, that man was still there. He didn't leave because leaving was the one thing Haines would have noticed. He was inside the town when they searched for her, and inside the town when they found her. So how did 1,000 people who noticed everything notice nothing? That evening, by every account, was an ordinary one. Eileen at home with the younger kids. The long, pale evening outside. At some point in that stretch of not quite night, Eileen stepped out, and this is the sort of detail that in any other town, on any other night, would mean nothing at all. A teenager stepping out for a little while, in a place where teenagers came and went on foot all summer long, where the worst thing waiting outside was supposed to be the weather. She didn't come back. Now the way an absence gets discovered in a family home is quiet. There's no alarm. There's just the younger kids and the slow arrival of wrongness. Eileen's not here. She should be here. She's the one watching us. The adults come home to a house that's short one person, and for the first hour or so, everybody's mind does what minds in a safe town are built to do. She's at a friend's. She lost track of the light, easy to do when the sky won't commit to night. Somebody will have seen her. In Haines, somebody always saw you. That was the whole deal, the unwritten contract of the place. You gave up your privacy, and in exchange, nobody could ever be lost. But the phone calls to the other families came back empty. And so, the way it happens in a town that size, the story goes that the search simply became everyone. There was no machinery to wait for, no big city department, no helicopters. There were neighbors and family and people who knew her face. And you can picture what that looks like in a town like Haines, the shoreline, the tree lines, the gravel roads, and her name being called by voices that knew her, not the missing girl, but Eileen, called out by people who had watched her grow up, in the tone you use for someone you fully expect to answer. And while they searched, the town's geography did its quiet work. The ferry ran its schedule, people watched who boarded. The airstrip had its short list of passengers, people knew every name on it. The border station up the highway logged its cars. This is the part that separates Haines from every other missing person story you've ever heard. In a town like that, within a day or two, people could be reasonably certain of something most investigations never, ever get. The arithmetic of the place said that, in all likelihood, nobody had left. Whatever had happened to Eileen Wafer, the answer had not driven away, had not flown away, had not sailed away. The answer, almost certainly, was still inside the town limits, breathing the same salmon and diesel air as everyone looking for her. 4 days passed like that. 4 days of searching, of waiting, of the ferry coming and going under watchful eyes. And then, on June 14th, they found her, and it was her own older brother, walking the beach at Portage Cove with her boyfriend who found her. Her body was close to home, not out in the wilderness that surrounds Haines on every side, not up a mountain, not lost to the water, none of the vast Alaskan emptiness that could have swallowed her and explained itself. She was found near her own neighborhood, a distance you could walk in minutes. She had never been far away at all. All those days of searching and calling, she had been almost within the sound of her own name. She had been killed. I'm not going to walk you through the details because they don't belong to us, and because the detail that matters, the one that broke something in that town, isn't medical. It's mathematical. Follow the arithmetic the way Haines had to. Eileen was killed close to home, inside the town. Nobody unknown had arrived. There was nowhere to arrive from without being seen. Nobody had left. Every exit was watched and the exits held, which meant the man who killed her was not a shadow from outside the world of Haines. He was inside it. He was one of the 1,000. He was, that week, standing in the search lines or watching them pass his window. He was buying groceries. He was drinking coffee at somebody's kitchen table while the town talked about nothing else, nodding along, saying what everybody was saying, terrible, just terrible, who could do such a thing. And he alone in the whole town knew the answer to the question, because the answer was him. The Alaska State Troopers came in and did what you do. They interviewed the town, and think about what that meant in Haines. This wasn't a canvas of anonymous city blocks. The troopers were sitting down, one kitchen at a time, with people who all knew each other, asking each of them about the others, and somewhere in that stack of interviews, in all likelihood, is a conversation with the man himself. He would have answered the same questions his neighbors answered. Where were you that evening? Did you know Eileen? Everyone knew Eileen. He would have said so too, and it would have been true. And the second question, how did nobody notice, comes down to one thing, and it's the part of this story I find hardest to sit with. The town's whole system of safety was recognition. Every face known, every arrival seen. But that system has exactly one blind spot, and it's total. It cannot see a known face doing an unknown thing. A stranger lurking near the Wafer home that Haines would have caught in an hour. A neighbor walking where neighbors walk, at an hour when the sky never gets dark enough to hide anyone because nobody needed hiding. That was invisible. He didn't defeat the town's watchfulness. He was inside it, vouched for by 1,000 people's certainty that they knew everyone worth suspecting. No arrest came. Weeks went by, then seasons. The fishing fleet went out and came back, and the case did the thing that cases do in places too small to forget them. It didn't fade, it settled. It sank down into the town like the salmon smell in the dock planks, permanent, part of the air. Parents who had never once thought about where their kids were at 10 on a June evening started thinking about it. Some doors that had never known a key started locking, and underneath the ordinary business of a small town, the school events, the harbor seasons, the funerals and weddings where everyone still gathered, because where else would they go, there was now a permanent, unspoken calculation running behind people's eyes. It's someone. It's someone here. Is it him? Is it him? The years turned into decades. Kids who were Eileen's age grew up, took over the boats, raised their own kids in the same town, and had to decide what to tell them. Some of the people who searched for her that week are gone now, and it is entirely possible the arithmetic never stopped working, that the man is gone too, that he lived out his whole life in that town, was known by name to everyone, was helped and greeted and mourned, and carried it to a grave with a view of the water, or he's still there, an old man now in a small town where everybody knows him. To this day, no one has ever been charged with killing Eileen Wafer. The first question, who, in a town of known faces, would do this, has never been answered. And the second question never got answered either. It just got sadder. Nobody noticed anything, because the thing they would have needed to notice was a face they trusted. In a town of 1,000 people, everybody knew Eileen, which means, almost certainly, everybody knew the man who killed her. They just never found out which neighbor he was. Part 3. From a town with too few people to a party with too many. Linwood, Kansas, April of 1988. What makes this next story different from the one you just heard is this. In Haines, the problem was that almost nobody could have seen anything. In Linwood, the problem is the opposite. On the last night anyone ever saw Randy Leach, he was standing in the middle of a party, a farmhouse party, end of the school year, with dozens of teenagers coming and going all night long. Dozens of witnesses. Dozens of people who talked to him, stood next to him, watched him walk through the house. And when investigators sat those witnesses down, one by one, and asked them the simplest question there is, when did you last see Randy and what was he doing, they did not get one story. They got dozens of stories, and almost none of them matched. One kid said he was fine. Another said no, he was sick, he could barely stand. One saw him leave alone. One saw him leave with somebody. Somebody put him by the car, somebody else put him inside the house. He never said goodbye. He said goodbye to me personally. Sometime before dawn on April 16, 1988, a 17-year-old boy and a full-size family car vanished from a farm outside a small Kansas town, in front of more people than most of us see in a week. And so the question to carry through this one is this: how does a boy and an entire car disappear in front of that many people, and not one of them can say how? Let me tell you about Linwood. It sits in the northeast corner of Kansas, in the Kaw River Valley between Lawrence and Kansas City, a farm town of a few hundred people, the kind of place where the school and the grain elevator are the two tallest things on the horizon. In the spring of 1988, if you drove through it, you'd have passed pickup trucks parked outside the co-op, a couple of church signs, kids riding bikes down the middle of the road because there was no traffic to worry about. Everybody knew everybody. Phone numbers were 4 digits after the prefix, and half the town didn't bother writing them down because they knew them by heart. Randy Leach was 17 that spring, a senior at Linwood's little high school, and by every account, and I mean every account because this is one of the only things all the witnesses agree on, he was a quiet, steady, dependable kid. He wasn't a partier. He wasn't in trouble. He had no history of running off, no fight with his parents, no girlfriend drama anybody knew about, no reason on this earth to leave. He lived with his mother and father, Alberta and Harold Leach, and he was close to them. The kind of close where a teenage boy still tells his mom where he's going and roughly when he'll be back. And that spring, Randy had things ahead of him. Graduation was only weeks away. He was about to walk with his class that May, and he had a job lined up, plans for afterward, ordinary, forward-looking teenage plans, the kind of small, concrete future that runaways don't tend to have and don't tend to leave. I bring that up now because for the rest of this story, people are going to suggest he left on his own, and I want you to have already met the kid well enough to know how that idea would have sounded to anyone who actually knew him. On the evening of Friday, April 15, 1988, there was a party out at a farmhouse a few miles from town. It was a pre-graduation party, end of the school year coming up, seniors about to walk, that loose, warm feeling of a small-town spring when everything is almost over. Randy asked to go. His parents said yes, and they let him take the family car, a 1985 Dodge, a big, ordinary gray 4-door, the kind of car half the driveways in Kansas had some version of. Now, sit with that detail for a second because it matters more than anything else in this story. This is not a story about a boy who walked into the woods. Wherever Randy Leach went that night, roughly 2 tons of Detroit steel went with him. Randy had a curfew midnight. And by every account, he was the kind of kid who kept it every single time. He was expected home for it, and expected up early besides. He was going to help his parents out at home that Saturday. So Alberta Leach went to bed on the night of April 15, 1988, as the mother of a reliable boy who always came home on time, and woke up on April 16th into a morning that, for her, would never really end. Because Randy didn't come home. At first, and any parent will recognize this, it was irritation before it was fear. He's late. He fell asleep on somebody's couch. But the morning stretched on and the driveway stayed empty, and at some point irritation tipped over into something colder. And looking for your kid in 1988 meant two things: the kitchen wall phone and the school directory. Alberta and Harold started going down the list, calling the homes of the kids who'd been at that party, one household at a time, standing in their kitchen with the cord stretching across the room. "Hi, this is Alberta Leach. Randy's mom. Was Randy still there when you left?" And this is the moment the story turns, because the answers started coming back and the answers were wrong. Not wrong as in alarming, wrong as in they didn't fit together. One kid said Randy was fine, totally normal, last seen standing around outside. The next call, no, Randy was sick, really sick out of it, not himself at all, which was strange because Randy didn't drink. Another, he left early. Another, no, he was still there real late, I saw him near the car. Somebody had seen him inside the house as the party wound down. Somebody else was sure he'd already gone. Each phone call contradicted the one before it, and you can imagine Alberta Leach standing at that kitchen wall, writing things down, the picture getting less clear with every call instead of more. Dozens of teenagers had spent an entire night at a farmhouse with her son, and by the end of that Saturday, she knew less about his last hours than she'd known that morning. The sheriff's department was notified, and here the story runs into the second wall, because in 1988, a missing 17-year-old with a car looked, on paper, like a runaway, and the family has long said that's how those first days felt. Their son reportedly treated at first like just another teenager who might have run off. Never mind that Randy had no reason to run, no money missing, nothing packed, a curfew he never broke. The critical first days, the days when tire tracks are fresh and memories are sharp and stories haven't hardened, went by, the family has always maintained, without the kind of full-scale response you'd hope for. And his parents, who knew their son, who knew he had not run away, spent those days doing the searching themselves. When the searching did come, it was thorough and it went on for years. This is River Valley country, farm, ponds, creeks, the Kansas River itself running fat and brown past the bottomland. Stranger Creek was searched. The Kansas River was searched. The family organized searches of their own by air, by boat, on foot through the bottomland. And over the years, whenever a rumor pointed somewhere, and there were always rumors, somebody would go look. The story goes that ponds were dragged and wells were checked, that a field would get walked again. And every single time the answer came back the same: nothing, no boy. And this is the part that investigators kept circling back to, because it is the part that refuses to make sense: no car. Now let me tell you why the car matters so much. A person, God forgive us, is not that hard to hide. A gray 1985 Dodge four-door is. It's the size of a bedroom. It doesn't sink in a farm pond without leaving a pond with a car in it, and dragged ponds give up their cars. It doesn't sit in a barn for 35 years without somebody's kid, somebody's buyer, somebody's estate sale finding it. If it had been abandoned on a road anywhere in America, it had plates, and plates get run. If it went to a crusher or a chop shop, somebody drove it there, and somebody wrote something down or chose very deliberately not to. A car doesn't evaporate. A car is either found, or it was made to disappear by somebody who knew what they were doing, or got very, very lucky. And that's the understanding that settled over the investigation, slow and quiet, the same way it settled over the Leaches. This wasn't an accident nobody had found yet. Accidents leave the car. Which brought everything back to that farmhouse, and to the dozens of kids who were there, because whatever happened to Randy Leach started at that party in front of all of them. And when investigators went at those witnesses again and again over the years, the conflicting stories never resolved. They just held. The kids who said he was sick stayed with sick. The kids who said he was fine stayed with fine. Nobody's story broke and nobody's story matched. And over time, those teenagers became adults, became parents themselves, stayed in and around that valley, and the wall of not quite agreeing, not quite lying, not quite telling never came down. Investigators have said over the years that they believe people at that party no more than they've ever said. Think about what that means in a town the size of Linwood. It means the answer isn't lost, it's kept. And this is where I have to ask you to picture the Leach's side of it, because they didn't move away. They stayed in Linwood in the same house, with the same driveway, in a community small enough that they knew by name every person who had been at that party. They saw those people at church, at the ball games, at the funerals. Harold and Alberta Leach spent decades shaking hands with a crowd of people, knowing, not suspecting knowing, with the cold certainty of a closed list, that somewhere in that crowd was at least one person who could tell them where their son was. And year after year, handshake after handshake, that person looked at them and said nothing. And the rumors, I should say something about the rumors, because a town like that doesn't sit in silence without filling it with something. Over the years, there were whispers about what really happened at that party, about the car being put somewhere nobody would think to look, about who was supposedly involved. Some of those whispers were checked out. That's what some of those searches were about. None of them ever held. And rumors like that do their own quiet damage in a small town, because every unproven story points at somebody's son, somebody's neighbor, and then dissolves, leaving the suspicion behind like a stain. Linwood has been living inside that for a generation. They never stopped. That's the thing about this case that gets to everybody who touches it. The Leaches followed every rumor, sat through every reopened look at the file, gave interviews decade after decade saying the same thing in the same steady way. Somebody knows. We just want to bring him home. They grew old doing it. Harold passed away without an answer. Alberta kept on. And through all of it, through the searches and the rumors and the anniversaries and the reporters who came back every 10 years to write the story again, not one solid trace of Randy Leach or that gray Dodge has ever surfaced. Not a bumper, not a bone, not a plate. Nothing in more than 35 years from a disappearance that happened in front of dozens of people. So let's close the two questions this story opened, the way the family has had to close them, which is to say, not really. What happened to Randy between the middle of that party and dawn? To this day, no one knows, or rather, no one who knows has ever said. And why didn't the witnesses' stories ever line up? That one, I think, answers itself, and the answer is the cold part. Stories that don't match by accident tend to drift together over time. Stories that don't match for 35 years are being held apart. The silence in Linwood was never confusion. Confusion fades. This didn't. One sentence. That's all it would take. Not a confession necessarily, just a location. A pond, a field, a name. One sentence from one person at one party in April of 1988, and a mother gets to bring her son home. Randy's parents kept his bedroom the way he left it. The driveway stayed empty. In 35 years, nobody in Linwood has ever said the one sentence that would end it. Part 4. This last one is the one I promised you at the start. It's not about a death, and no one ever went to prison. It's about a routine, and about how long someone can stand in the dark learning it. Now, before we get into this one, I want to tell you where it comes from because it's different from the other three. This isn't a case file. There was no task force, no headlines, no anniversary articles. This is a story that was shared by the woman it happened to, she told it herself, years later, and I'm going to tell it to you the way she told it. I'm not going to use her name, and I'm not going to name the town because she never did. All you need to know is that it was small town America, sometime in the mid-1990s, and she was a woman in her 30s who lived alone. Well, almost alone. Here's the moment this whole story turns on. Sit with it a second before we back up. One evening, this woman comes home from work, checks her mail, and mixed in with the bills and the grocery store flyers, there's a plain envelope with no stamp and no return address. Somebody put it in her mailbox by hand. Inside is a single sheet of paper, and on that sheet of paper, in careful, unhurried handwriting, is a description of her evening. Not an evening, her evening, the one she has every night. What time her kitchen light comes on, what time the back door opens, what time the dog goes out into the yard, and then one detail that made her stand in her own driveway in daylight and go cold. The note said the dog scratches the back door twice when he wants to come in. Twice, not the dog scratches at the door. Twice. That was true. That had been true for years, and she had never once mentioned it to another living soul because who would you even tell? It was a small private thing between a woman and her dog. She'd assumed, the way you assume the sun will come up, that she and that dog were the only two creatures on Earth who knew it. So keep asking yourself this for the next few minutes. How long does somebody have to watch a house, in the dark, in the cold, night after night, to know a thing like that? Let's back up. Picture a quiet residential street in the mid-1990s. Not a farm road, not a city block. One of those in-between streets that small-town America is made of. Single-story houses, gravel driveways, yards that run together at the edges. And I want you to remember what the mid-90s actually felt like, because it matters here. No doorbell cameras. No motion sensor floodlights on every corner of every house. No cell phone glowing on the nightstand. If something happened outside your house at 11 at night, the only sensors you had were your own 2 ears and, if you were lucky, a dog. People on streets like this one left their doors unlocked half the time. Not because they were careless, because the whole math of the neighborhood said you could. Everybody knew everybody. That was the warranty. By now, 3 stories in, you and I both know what that warranty is actually worth. The woman at the center of this story had lived in her house for years. She worked days, came home around the same time every evening, and she had a big, easygoing dog, the kind of dog that's more of a roommate than a pet. And like a lot of people who live alone with a dog, the two of them had settled into a routine you could set a watch by. Every night, somewhere around 10:30, she'd open the back door and let him out into the fenced yard to do his business and sniff the fence line. She'd leave the porch light off. The neighbors' windows were right there and the yard was fenced, so why light it up? Then she'd go on with her night, and when the dog was ready to come in, he'd come up the back steps and scratch at the bottom of the door. 2 scratches. Always 2. A little pause between them like a knock. She'd open the door, he'd amble in, and that was the end of the day. Every night, same time, same signal for years. It was the safest feeling moment of her whole day. And somewhere out past that fence, in the dark she never lit, somebody had been taking notes. Which raises the second question this story hangs on. Not just who wrote that note, but how long had he been out there? Now the note didn't come out of nowhere. She only understood that afterward. Looking back, she could see the whole runway of small wrong things leading up to it, each one easy to dismiss on its own. There was the dog first. That easygoing dog who barely lifted his head for the mailman had started barking at the back fence at night. Not every night, some nights. He'd stand in the middle of the dark yard, stiff, facing the same back corner of the fence, and let out that low, serious bark dogs save for things they can actually see. She'd call him in, he'd come, and she'd tell herself it was a raccoon or a cat or the neighbor's trash cans. In the 90s, on a street like that, that's what it always was. Then there was the flower bed. She had a narrow strip of planting bed running along the inside of the back fence, right at that same corner, and one Saturday doing yard work, she found the soil pressed down. 2 depressions, side by side, deep and settled, like someone had stood there for a long time, or stood there many times, facing the house. She stared at them for a minute, then decided it must have been the meter reader or a kid cutting through, and she raked the bed smooth and went inside. A few weeks later, the depressions were back. Same corner, same direction. And then there was the pattern she almost didn't let herself see. She kept a social calendar like anybody, some evenings out with friends, some evenings her sister visited, most evenings alone. And the nights the dog went rigid at the fence, the nights she heard the gate latch tick when there was no wind, the nights something crunched once in the gravel and then went silent, those were never the nights her sister's car was in the driveway. They were only ever the nights she was alone. Now, one wrong night is a raccoon, 2 is a coincidence, but a pattern that tracks who is inside the house, that's not an animal. Animals don't check the driveway first. It was a few days after she'd raked that flower bed smooth, for the second time, that the envelope showed up in her mailbox. She took the note to the police. Of course she did. And the officer who read it was kind about it, but this was the mid-90s, and I need you to hear what the law could actually do with a piece of paper like that back then. No cameras to pull, no phone records that meant anything. Stalking laws in most states were brand new, a few years old, written thin, built for ex-husbands and known names, not for strangers standing in a flower bed. There was no crime on that page. Nobody had touched her, nobody had threatened her. Not in so many words. Describing someone's evening is not, it turns out, against the law. The police told her to keep her doors locked, keep the porch light on, call if anything happened. So she did. She locked the doors all the time now, a thing she'd never done. She started leaving lights on, and the noises stopped. The dog quit barking at the fence. Weeks went by, clean and quiet, and she let herself believe that whoever it was had gotten his strange little thrill from the note, seen the locked doors, and moved on. The quiet, she said later, was the trap. The quiet is what let her go back to the routine. The doors stayed locked, but the extra lights went dark again, one night at a time, and the backyard went back to being the unlit place it had always been. She stopped noticing that it had. And then came the night. An ordinary weeknight, late fall, cold enough that the furnace was running. Her sister had come by earlier and gone home. Around 10:30, right on schedule, she went to the back door to let the dog out. And this is the one detail that saved the whole night. The dog wouldn't go. He got to the open door, looked out at the dark yard, and backed up. Wouldn't cross the threshold. She stood there a second, cold air pouring in around her ankles, and then she shrugged, shut the door, locked it, and figured he could wait till morning. The dog followed her down the hallway toward the bedroom, and she turned off the kitchen light. And a few minutes later, from the back of the house, she heard it. Scratch, a pause, scratch. 2 scratches at the bottom of the back door, unhurried, perfectly spaced. The signal, her signal, and she was standing in the dark hallway looking directly at her dog, who was beside her, frozen, hackles up, staring toward the kitchen. The dog was inside. Something on the back steps had just asked to be let in. She told it plainly years later. In that moment she understood everything at once, and none of it arrived as a thought. It arrived as a fact whole in her chest. The scratching was timed to the exact minute the dog usually came in. It came the way the dog did it, low on the door, 2 strokes, that little pause between. Whoever was on those steps wasn't guessing. He had heard that sound from close by so many times that he could perform it. He'd been counting on her doing what she had done every night for years. hear 2 scratches in the dark, and open the door without looking. He hadn't been watching her house. You can watch a house in a week. He had memorized her life. And that's the answer to the second question, the how long. You don't learn a signal like that from the street in passing. You learn it standing in a flower bed at the fence line in the cold, on the nights the driveway is empty over and over for as long as it takes. Months at the very least. Years, maybe. Nobody will ever know the number, and I'm not sure knowing it would help. She didn't open the door. She didn't freeze either. She grabbed the dog's collar, got to the phone in the front room and called the police, whispering, crouched below the window line while the dog stood over her growling at the back of the house. The scratching had stopped. The house was silent except for the furnace. A patrol car was close and it came in fast with its lights off, and the officer's spotlight caught him, a man, coming over her back fence, right at that corner by the flower bed. Grown man, dark jacket. He dropped into the neighbor's yard and was gone between the houses before the officer was even out of the car. They searched the block. They never found him. In the flower bed, in the beam of a flashlight, there they were again. 2 settled depressions in the soil, side by side, facing the back door. He was never caught. I want to be straight with you about that, because after 3 stories tonight, you've earned the truth over a tidy ending. A man was seen, one time, for about 2 seconds going over a fence. Some people in town had their private guesses. A name or 2 got murmured, the way names do, but no one was ever identified. No one was ever arrested, and no note like that ever turned up in anyone's mailbox again. Whoever he was, the odds are he stayed exactly where he'd always been, nearby. A face at the gas station, a cart passing hers at the grocery store, someone who knew her evenings by heart and whom she wouldn't know from any other man on that street. She sold the house within the year and moved away, different town. And she never said which one, and after everything you've just heard, I think you understand why. Now, at the start of tonight, I told you the last story was the one I still think about when I let my own dog out at night. And I want to be precise about why, because it isn't the man in the yard. Every town has a man like that. 3 of tonight's stories say so. It's the patience. It's the idea that the warmest, most harmless ritual in a person's day, a dog scratching twice at a back door, can be observed and learned, and rehearsed by someone standing quietly in the dark, and you will never feel it happening. Radiation, at least, can be measured. Patience can't. So yes, every night when my dog hits the bottom of that door, some part of me is standing in her hallway. Her, though, she did the only thing there was to do. She got a new house, new locks, new routine. But every night when the dog scratches twice at the door, she waits a moment before opening it and counts the scratches. And that's where I'm going to leave you tonight. 4 stories. An oil field in Oklahoma, a fishing town in Alaska, a farm outside Linwood, Kansas, and a quiet backyard somewhere nobody names anymore. 4 answers that were never far away, close enough to touch, really. A source that had to be somewhere. A neighbor who had to be someone. A car that had to go somewhere. A man who had to be standing right there, night after night, in the dark by the fence. And nobody ever found out. Not the troopers, not the parents, not the woman counting scratches at her back door. Maybe somebody out there still could. That thought is either a comfort or it isn't. I'll let you decide which. Next time, I've got a story from the winter of 1976 about a lighthouse crew on the Oregon coast who radioed the mainland to report a visitor. The problem was what they said next. Until then, lock up, let the dog in and get some sleep. Good night.